What's up everybody, how's it going? It's been a while since I made another video, but I'm back. And while I was gone, I ended up getting myself another camera, a new camera, that has a lot better video quality. So the videos I'm going to be putting out now will have a little bit better quality, which I guess makes them a little bit more enjoyable. So while I was gone, I've been reading a couple books, and one of those books is this classic right here. One of my all-time favorites, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, which is the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. This was actually one of the first books I ever really read in terms of like getting into reading. I got really passionate about The Lord of the Rings when I saw the movie years and years ago when I was young, like my mid-teens. And ever since I saw the movies, I was just amazed at, like, you know, how big of a scope the adventure in this story is, you know, the magnitude of the world that Tolkien created. So J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, you know, just like a little bit of a background on him for those of you who don't know, he was a philologist, and a philologist is someone who studies language. He studied languages from all around the world. He was fascinated with languages. And I mean, he was really nerdy with this kind of stuff because he ended up making his own languages. And after he made his own languages, he kind of came to the conclusion that, okay, if you make a language, there's obviously someone who needs to speak that language. So he wanted to create different kinds of cultures and people who spoke the languages that he was making. And from this whole creative project, he kind of made his own world, his own mythology, if you will, with different kinds of creatures, and he made stories in this world, and that's where you get books like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So by now you guys should already know I'm a big Tolkien fan. I have on my blog like I think maybe 6 or 7 part review of The Hobbit, where I kind of like break down the different parts of The Hobbit and just talk about my thoughts on it and the things I like about that story. And The Lord of the Rings is a story in much bigger magnitude than The Hobbit, obviously, because it's a trilogy and it covers a much bigger story than The Hobbit does. And with that being said, you know, I'm here living in New Zealand. This is where they filmed the Lord of the Rings trilogy, like the film. So, you know, I think it's only fitting that I spend some time reading Lord of the Rings while I'm here, right? So, talking about this first book in the trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring, this is the book that sets it all off. Reading this book, The Fellowship of the Ring, was really awesome because it was kind of like a nostalgic experience, because I haven't read this trilogy since I was in like my mid-teens. And, you know, coming back to this book, it was kind of like you just begin to remember how great of a story it is, just how epic of a story it is from beginning to end. And this book is actually, or all the books in this trilogy are broken into 2 books, right? So there's book 1 and book 2 in this book, and there's book 3, book 4 in the next, and then book 5 and book 6 in the last one. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create 6 videos for these books. 1 video for book 1 of The Fellowship of the Ring, and then book 2, or another video for book 2 of The Fellowship of the Ring, just kind of breaking down each of these books separately and getting into depth of like what they cover, what parts of the story are talked about in those different books. So book 1 of The Fellowship of the Ring, it starts off in the Shire. This is where the hobbits live. Hobbits essentially are really, really small people. They're very short. They have hairy feet. They drink a lot of beer. They smoke a lot of tobacco. They eat a lot of food. Kind of similar to humans, but a little different in the sense that they're very short, hairy feet, etc., etc. But essentially, you know, book 1 of The Fellowship of the Ring, it starts off with Bilbo, the hero from The Hobbit, and he's celebrating his 111th birthday. Now you're like, 111 years old, that's really old. Do hobbits usually live that long? And the answer is no. Why is Bilbo so old? How is he able to live this old and obviously not be dead yet? So the thing is if you've read The Hobbit, you know that Bilbo gets the ring in The Hobbit. And obviously, as the title of this book suggests, The Lord of the Rings, one of the major things in this book is an evil ring. And it's evil because it was forged by Sauron, who is this dark lord, this dark figure in the lore and in the past of Middle-earth. So eventually, as time has gone on, Sauron lost the ring. Long story short, Bilbo finds it, and he has this ring, and because this ring is a magic and powerful ring, it essentially grants Bilbo or anybody else who has it long life. They're not going to age as rapidly as they would age if they didn't have this ring. And that's why Bilbo is so old. That's how Bilbo is able to be 111 years old. The book starts off with Bilbo celebrating his 111th birthday. Now, Frodo, who is one of the main, if not the main character of this book, the main figure, I guess you could say the protagonist, he is Bilbo's nephew. Okay, so it's Bilbo Baggins and his nephew, Frodo Baggins. Bilbo and Frodo, they share the same birthday, so it's kind of like both of their parties, but you know, before the party starts, Gandalf shows up to the Shire, and Gandalf and Bilbo are friends based on all the adventures that Bilbo and Gandalf went on in The Hobbit. So Gandalf shows up, and Bilbo essentially tells Gandalf that he's tired of the Shire. He doesn't feel that there's anything there for him anymore, and he kind of wants to leave and go off and do his own thing and see elves and mountains and all that stuff all over again. So Gandalf knows that Bilbo wants to leave, but what he doesn't know is that Bilbo is actually going to pull a stunt off at his party, and what Bilbo essentially does is he puts the ring on while he's giving a speech to all the hobbits at his party. And when you put the ring on, it makes you invisible. And so Bilbo just disappears in the middle of his speech, and all the hobbits are like, where did he go? Where did he go? They don't understand, and they're freaked out. And after he pulls that prank, Bilbo just goes home, packs his things, and then leaves for the Shire. But before he does, you know, he talks with Gandalf, because Gandalf goes and finds Bilbo at his house. And as he's leaving, Gandalf sees that Bilbo's reluctant to leave this ring behind because he's leaving different things to Frodo. And Gandalf's like, are you going to leave this ring behind? And Bilbo doesn't want to. And that's one of the things about this magic ring is it corrupts the person who possesses it. If you have this ring, you don't want to give it up. You want the ring for yourself. It basically taps into all of our selfish desires, and we all want to possess the ring for ourselves, or somebody wants to possess the ring for themselves, and they're driven by its greed, right? So Bilbo's reluctant. He doesn't want to let it go, but Gandalf convinces him you need to let it go, and he eventually says, okay, here, you can give it to Frodo. So then Gandalf becomes suspicious through Bilbo's behavior, being so reluctant to give up the ring, and he tells Frodo, just keep that ring, keep it in an envelope, just keep it safe, don't use it. Gandalf goes, he leaves the Shire, he does some research, and he actually realizes that this is the evil ring that belongs to Sauron. So he goes back, and he tells Frodo the bad news, and Frodo's distressed. He's like, what do we do? Gandalf and Frodo realize it can't stay in the Shire, because then the Dark Lord and his servants are just going to come to the Shire and, you know, kill everybody and take the ring. So Frodo and Gandalf decide it's best that they take the ring out of the Shire and they go to where the elves live, which is a place called Rivendell. And once they get there, they'll figure out what they're going to do with the ring. So Frodo takes it upon himself. He eventually, over some time, he packs his things, he gets himself ready to leave on this journey. So luckily for Frodo, he's accompanied by two of his friends. One is Sam and the other is Pippin. They're both hobbits too. So book one of the Fellowship of the Ring essentially just tells the story of how Frodo, Sam, and Pippin, and eventually they meet up with their friend Merry, how they leave the Shire and how they get their way to Rivendell. And there's many different places that they go. They stop at many different locations, they meet different people, they meet elves, they meet different people and figures in Middle-earth. They meet this one powerful ancient figure in Middle-earth named Tom Bombadil, who's not in the movies, but I can see why he's not in the movies, because honestly he doesn't really serve much of a purpose in this book. You just kind of meet this one person. But anyway, they go through these different places, these different locations, you know, like the Old Forest. You know, they go to the Barrow Downs, they go to these different locations, and they experience different adversities. One of the things that adds tension and, you know, conflict in the book is these hobbits, they obviously want to get safely to Rivendell to get the ring away from the Shire, but there's these 9 black riders, right? They have these black garments that they wear and these black hoods that go over their head, and you really can't see their face. It's just darkness, right? And these are 9 riders who are servants of Sauron, and they're here to get the ring and bring it back to the Dark Lord. So this entire time that these hobbits are trying to get to Rivendell, they're being pursued and they're being followed and chased by these 9 riders, and they're trying their best to avoid being caught by these riders. Eventually, they meet this one guy named Strider. And Strider, his real name is Aragorn, and we find out in the book that he's actually the descendant of kings. He's not a king now, he's actually what they call a ranger. He kind of like wanders about. He's very skilled with the sword, he's a very skilled swordsman, he's a very skilled warrior, but he hasn't really taken up the position of being king, despite the fact that he is in the bloodline of kings, right? He's technically the rightful heir to a kingdom called Gondor. So Strider, he is a friend of Gandalf's, and he meets up with the hobbits, and he realizes that these are the hobbits who are carrying the ring, and he offers to help them. He says, hey, let me come along with you. I can help you guys get to Rivendell safely. And because the hobbits are scared, they're frightened because they're being chased by these riders, they're like, okay, you can come and help us. So once these black riders, they eventually catch up to the hobbits, one of them ends up stabbing Frodo in the chest. And these black riders, they're also known as ring wraiths or Nazgul. And they have blades that if it stabs you, it's going to slowly but surely deteriorate your personality. You're just going to change and kind of morph into this creature or something like that. Just something that's not what you currently are. And so Frodo gets stabbed, and they're very worried about him. They're like, what are we going to do? He needs, legitimate medical treatment, and we don't have that treatment. But luckily, there's an elf that they know who ends up running into them, and he says, I can take Frodo on my horseback, and I can bring him to Rivendell safely. And they all say, that's a good idea. That's cool. Go ahead and do that. And Frodo and this elf, as they're riding to Rivendell, though, the black riders end up catching up to them. Right as these ring wraiths are about to catch Frodo and the elf, they're crossing through this river, and this huge, wave crashes upon them and wipes them out. And that's really the power of the elves, because the elves could sense that these black riders were in their area and that they were a threat, so they kind of called upon their magic of the land, and these waves end up crashing and wiping out the black riders, which is kind of like the end of the book. It kind of puts an end to the storyline of them being pursued, and that's how book 1 ends. It ends with Frodo getting to Rivendell safely, and these black riders have been wiped out. They're not technically dead, but they've been wiped out to the point where they won't be a problem for some time. They'll have to regroup themselves. So that's essentially what happens in book 1. It basically covers Frodo and the hobbits and their journey from the Shire to Rivendell, and just making their way through and trying to avoid those black riders in the process. It was definitely really great to reread this book. One of the things about this book and about Lord of the Rings and about J.R.R. Tolkien as an author in general is that he tends to be very descriptive, overly descriptive. People don't talk about it in a good way. They usually critique him as being too explanatory, giving too many details, because J.R.R. Tolkien could look at a tree like this, or he could be describing a tree and he'll use a paragraph just to describe the scenery, and he just kind of goes into excessive detail with things. And I agree with that. I think that he does go into too much detail at times, but it's not completely bad. And it's not completely bad because Tolkien developed over his lifetime a very complex and detailed world. And part of what this description and explanation do when you read it in this book is it gives you a very vivid picture of the world around you. And they often say, fans of this book often say that in this book, the world itself is a character. And you do get that feeling from this book. The world, because of all this excessive description, because of all of this explanation into what the scenery looks like, and the descriptions of the different, you know, kingdoms and communities and the different regions, it does make you feel like the world could be a real place. You know, when you read different books, you kind of feel that you're transported to a different world and you are in a different place than you currently are, you know, in your imagination. And, you know, if there's anybody who I think is like the king of imagination, it's probably J.R.R. Tolkien. Despite his excessive descriptions, he does a great job of creating a world that feels very real, and it feels like a place that really does exist rather than just something that's a figment of another person's imagination. One thing I like about this book and about this story in general is how it starts off in a very good and safe place. It starts in the Shire, which is this friendly little place where everything's green and it's beautiful and flowers and nature and, you know, friendly hobbits and life is simple. But where this journey takes you is it takes you to a very dangerous place. It takes you outside of this little comfort, like this comforting area, and it takes you all the way eventually by the end of the book to Mordor, where, you know, the Dark Lord and, you know, the shadows all are from. And, you know, the difference between where you start and where you end is one thing I really like about this story. It takes you out of a comforting area and leads you down all of these dangerous roads, which kind of, in my opinion, kind of symbolizes how it might be for us as individuals. You might have a place in your life, or you might be in a place in your life where you're comfortable, you know. You're comfortable with where you are, you're comfortable with what you're doing, and there might be certain things that you could do, but that would require you to get out of this comfort zone that you have, right? The metaphorical Shire, you know, you might have to leave your Shire, which is the area where everything is safe and good, and you might have to go ahead and enter into conflicts and dangers, you know, and these dangers being, you know, unexplored territory in your life that challenges you and makes you do something that you might not be comfortable with. But the same way that these characters grow, even just in book one, all of the adversity that they go through, it changes them, it molds them, it helps them grow into more courageous, braver, I guess more respectable people. Or in this case, not people, but hobbits, right? And that's one thing I like about this book. Along with all of those things, I mean, when you read this book, it's just, you really get an appreciation for J.R.R. Tolkien and the creativity that he has. Because, I mean, all of the different figures, or I guess you could say species that live in Middle-earth. You've got, you know, elves and dwarves, but hobbits is a very creative thing. You know, a hobbit had never existed before Tolkien. Like, obviously, in ancient mythology, there were elves and dwarves and, you know, wizards and men. And Tolkien was definitely well-read in terms of different world mythologies. He was inspired by Norse mythology, Scandinavian mythology, you know, all of those different ancient myths and stories. And he took a lot of those influences and he put it into his own stories. Like, for example, Gandalf and the names of many of the different dwarves in The Hobbit. If you read Norse mythology, specifically if you read this one book called the Poetic Edda, all of those names that the dwarves have, and the name Gandalf itself, those are all names that come from Norse mythology. And Tolkien just took those names and put them into Middle-earth. But one area where Tolkien gets really creative is with hobbits. He kind of just creates this unique species, and he says, okay, we'll make them shorter. They're like people, but they're shorter. They have hairy feet, you know, just like, you know, simple creativity like that in terms of being able to push and make something new, I think is something that's respectable and something that is cool about Tolkien. Not only did he get creative with the kingdoms and the world that he created, but he also creates his own little species called hobbits. So that is my thoughts on the Fellowship of the Ring, or at least book one of the Fellowship of the Ring. I'll make another video soon covering book 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring. But in the meantime, that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video after me being gone for so long. I hope you guys liked this video. Have you guys read this book? If you have read this book, what do you like about it? What do you dislike about it? Do you also think that Tolkien is a little too descriptive sometimes in how he describes things? What's your favorite part about this book? What have you heard about this book? Anyway, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.